Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now we have that straightened out. Which of the seatmates here is going to be speaking? I'm very pleased to rise today to speak on this Opposition Day motion from my colleagues down the way. And I'm going to review a bit, some of what's in the motion. I think it's worth reviewing. It's important for people to understand what it is that we're talking about, especially when there's been a pause for question period in the debate. So let's see what the motion says. It says that given the recent sworn statements by RCMP Corporal Greg Horton, which revealed that 1. February 21, 2013, the Prime Minister's office had agreed that, with regard to Mike Duffy's controversial expenses, the Conservative Party of Canada would, quote, keep him whole on repayment, unquote. 2. On February 22, 2013, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff wanted to speak to the Prime Minister before everything else is considered final. Thank you. 3. Later, February 22, 2013, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff confirmed, quote, we are good to go from the PM once Ben has his confirmation from Payne, unquote. 4. An agreement was reached between Benjamin Perrin and Janice Payne, counsels for the Prime Minister, and Mike Duffy. 5. The amount to keep Mike Duffy whole was calculated to be higher than first determined, requiring a changed source of funds from Conservative Party funds to Nigel Wright's personal funds, after which the arrangement proceeded and Duffy's expenses were repaid. And 6. Subsequently, the Prime Minister's office engaged in the obstruction of a Deloitte audit and a whitewash of a Senate report. And then the motion goes on to say that in view of that, the House condemns the Prime Minister's office's actions in devising, organizing, and participating in an arrangement that the RCMP believes violated sections 119, 121, and 122 of the Criminal Code, and so on. In fact, it also, I should mention, it reminds the Prime Minister of his own code of conduct for ministers, which surely applies to him, and which says on page 28 that, quote, ministers and ministers of state are personally responsible for the conduct and operation of their offices and the exempt staff in their employ, unquote. Now, the Prime Minister is a minister. He's one of the ministers to whom that rule ought to apply. So it's hard to understand how he could think he shouldn't take responsibility for the actions of his own staff if it were the case, in fact, if we were to believe, in fact, that he didn't actually know what was going on, which is a little hard to believe in his case. And so, Mr. Speaker, the cover-up continues. The Prime Minister's Office fraud squad really have been the authors of a scheme whereby we've seen the bribing of a sitting senator and seeing it swept under the rug until the truth leaked out via CTV's Robert Fife. But I see across from me, it's a sad sight, Mr. Speaker, I see across from me the cowering Conservative caucus. And the silence from that side today has been deafening, when only one of them has gotten up to speak on this motion. It's a remarkable thing. Aside from the vitriol from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, we've seen no one else on that side who deigned to make a speech, I gather, on this all day long. So perhaps, if that's not true, one of them says it's not true, let's hear them speak then, because there's lots of time this afternoon. I hope we'll hear from lots of them this afternoon, that they can speak on this and tell us what they really think, because we know that some of them are actually telling the media what they think, although they're doing it anonymously. They're saying, in fact, that they are concerned about this. They're not happy with the Prime Minister's actions or his office. And the way this has been handled, in their view, has been slipshod. So why don't they get up now in this House this afternoon and talk about that? It's a sad day, Mr. Speaker, for democracy and accountability. Canadians, in fact, that I've talked to in recent weeks have been shocked to see the level that this government will go to cover up its misdeeds. Canadian taxpayers also want to know who will take responsibility for the ethical rot that has beset this Conservative government. Well, let's think about that. Who should take responsibility? Should it be perhaps the person who appointed Senator Duffy? Should it be perhaps the person who hired Nigel Wright to be his own Chief of Staff? Should it be the person who promoted the other key players involved in this corrupt scheme to jobs, to senior jobs in ministers' offices?
All of the above.
Well, sadly, Mr. Speaker, the person we all know we're talking about refuses to accept any responsibility and comes up with story after story, an ever-changing story, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's a sad day when even Mayor Ford is more open and honest about his behavior than his own fishing buddy, the Prime Minister.
That's right.
Now, of course, Mayor Ford was caught, and he admitted it after he was caught, but nevertheless, but the fact is that nobody on that side really wants to defend this ethical rot. It's clear that even conservative backbenchers recognize that what started out as a Senate scandal has spread well beyond Duffy and Wright, and has now engulfed about a dozen senior conservatives and even the Prime Minister himself. And it's clear, as more and more conservative members of Parliament are saying in private, that their strategy of crisis management from the Prime Minister's office has been a disaster from day one. Let me turn to something that I found in this week's Hill Times, which quotes senior conservatives, in fact, as saying this, quote, "Everybody needs people who will ask you the questions that you don't necessarily want to be asked. Everybody needs to be challenged a bit. It makes you think better," unquote. Now this person, these senior conservatives, were actually talking, of course, about the Prime Minister, the fact that a Prime Minister needs to have people in his office or her office who challenge the Prime Minister. Now, can any of us in this country really imagine that from this particular Prime Minister, that he would want to have that? A Prime Minister who has such determined control, not only over his own office, but over his ministers and what they're allowed to say, even though what the backbenchers are allowed to say. Everything has to be approved by the PMO. And so it's clear to me the Prime Minister is not interested in having the kind of people in his office that these senior conservatives are suggesting he ought to have. Apparently he knows better. Apparently he knows better than anybody else and doesn't need to have anybody's advice or anyone really challenging him. Well, that's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. But you know, you think about it, there's another angle to this we haven't heard a lot about, and that is that what we had here last winter was a problem for the Conservative Party. It was a Conservative Party political PR problem. What was it solved with? A $90,000 contribution. Now, of course, any individual in Canada can make a maximum contribution to a political party of $1,200. So we know that $90,000 is an illegal contribution. That's in addition to the other aspects of this in terms of making payment to a senator to make some kind of a deal. But let's go through the record, which clearly shows that the Prime Minister is not being completely open and honest with Canadians about his involvement in this corrupt cover-up scheme. The Prime Minister says he never knew anything, that he says he heard no evil, he says he saw no evil, he says he spoke no evil. Well, Nigel Wright's own words show that is unbelievable. On February 22nd, in email, let's call it email number 1 on that day, from Mr. Wright, he said he wanted to, quote, "speak to the PM before everything is considered final," unquote. Speak to the PM before everything is considered final. And then an hour later or thereabouts, we have email number 2. He says, quote, "we are good to go from the PM," unquote. Now, I think, Mr. Speaker, that most Canadians and most sensible people would say, well, he must have spoken to the PM during that hour. There must have been a conversation between Nigel Wright and the Prime Minister between those 2 emails. And it sure sounds like the Prime Minister gave the okay. Now, the Prime Minister claims that all he ever said was that Mr. Duffy had to make the repayment himself. Well, if that were the case, I mean, surely he'd been saying that for days and days, even weeks, before February 22nd. Surely he'd made that very clear already. So why would Nigel Wright have to go to him to get him to approve what he'd already been saying had to happen? That doesn't make much sense, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that really makes sense was that Nigel Wright went to the Prime Minister, told him, it seems, that the Conservative Party was prepared to pay $30,000 at that point to pay off Mr. Duffy's debt, which would be equally improper, and it would appear that the Prime Minister thought that was okay, that was good to go. The Prime Minister gave the thumbs up. I mean, that's certainly the interpretation that most sensible people would take from those two emails. It's hard to imagine any other conceivable interpretation. Talk about a smoking gun, Mr. Speaker. And what about Nigel Wright's statement to the RCMP? He said, quote, "The PM knows in broad terms only that I personally assisted Duffy when I was getting him to agree to repay the expenses." So that one statement makes it crystal clear that the Prime Minister knew that Wright personally assisted Duffy. It leaves not a lot of doubt, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that, as the RCMP alleges, Conservative operatives in the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister's hand-picked Senate leaders either broke the law or took part in a cover-up designed to make the scandal go away. They either broke the law or took part in a cover-up designed to make the scandal go away.
Terrible.
Shameful activity. The Prime Minister's story regarding the PMO ethics scandal has fallen apart. This is obviously a very serious issue, and hence this motion today, which I think is very appropriate. Today's motion talks about the PMO fraud squad's potentially criminal cover-up and a series of events which the RCMP believe may have violated 3 sections of the Criminal Code, not to mention the Elections Act in terms of election spending or donations to political parties, which effectively, in my view, this was. Today's motion also talks about the role of senior Conservative operatives and senior senators handpicked by the Prime Minister who participated in a whitewash of a Senate report and apparently attempted to influence an independent audit being conducted by Deloitte. The record, I think, is pretty clear on that as well. We've seen lots of commentary, lots of reports on this in the media, and they come direct from the documents obtained by the RCMP. The list of suspects in this caper is indeed long and probably going to grow. On the Senate side, there are Senators Carolyn Stewart-Olson, Marjorie LeBreton, David Tkachuk, and Irving Gerstein. And of course, former Conservative poster boy Mike Duffy. In the Prime Minister's office, or either now or formerly, I suppose, we have Nigel Wright, Benjamin Perrin, Ray Novak, Chris Woodcock, Patrick Rogers, and David Van Hammond, and a bunch of those have been promoted since this all took place. So it's quite a twisted story with a lot of conflicting accounts that need to be cleared up so Canadians can have confidence in Parliament. And that's the reason why there ought to be hearings on this and testimony from people like the Prime Minister. For instance, Senator Duffy said in a statement from the Senate that the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright, had provided assurances to him that his behavior was acceptable, and as such he would give him a $90,000 check to cover the Prime Minister's tracks. Senator Duffy also confirmed that he was told to take the $90,000, keep his mouth shut, and go along with the cover-up, or the Conservatives would kick him out of the Senate. That's the threat that he alluded to. So, Mr. Speaker, we're here today pushing for more transparency. We've been pushing in this party for that for quite a while. We're here today trying to get to the truth for Canadians. Now, of course, there are many other things we ought to be discussing in the House of Commons. There are many other concerns Canadians have, like job creation, youth unemployment, environment, pipelines issues, the debt loads of individual Canadians that are very high, the cost of post-secondary education, the situation in Syria, the new agreement with Iran, and this government's attitude toward it. These things and many others, the report released today of the Auditor General, which expresses concern about the basic safety measures that are supposed to be overseen by this government, especially when it comes to rail and food safety, and yet we've seen things like the listeriosis crisis. But instead of talking about these important things, we're mired in this scandal. And why are we still talking about this scandal? Why are we mired as we are? The reason is because the Prime Minister refuses to answer questions. The Prime Minister refuses to come clean. The Prime Minister refuses to allow the House to hold hearings and to testify under oath about what he knew and didn't know and what happened here. That's all he has to do. Testify. 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 It's time for the Prime Minister to speak under oath and tell the truth. That, in fact, would get us on to other things, I would hope. The Prime Minister's Parliamentary Secretary has been here today showing contempt for hard-working Canadian taxpayers, as he's shown, unfortunately, in question period for weeks. And really, he and the PM are showing contempt for the values their party once prided itself on, and certainly values the Reform Party also prided itself on. Of course, the Prime Minister's Secretary has memorized the words that the kids in short pants in the Prime Minister's office have given him to say, and he's memorized them very well. And the Prime Minister and his Parliamentary Secretary, I think, would like nothing more than to sweep this whole affair under the rug, which of course was the original idea. Sure. When Nigel Wright and others in the PMO were overseeing what was happening in the Senate and trying to manage this whole thing so that it not only wouldn't even come out in the Deloitte report, but so that the Senate committee, they hoped, would whitewash it after Deloitte had done so, which of course in the end, thankfully, did not happen. And it's clear that this scandal falls squarely on the shoulders of this Prime Minister. It's time that he and his Parliamentary Secretary stopped stonewalling. It's time they stopped trying to cover up. It's time they were held accountable to Canadians for what's occurred on their watch. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.